Well, it's that time, so turn it on and turn it up. Welcome everyone to episode 2 of Texas World Language Radio. My name is James Ayers. I'm the Frisco ISD World Language Coordinator. And with me is my fabulous co-host and our voice of reason on this podcast, Region 10 World Language Master Consultant, Dr. Meredith Clark. Meredith, how are you doing today?
Okay, James, I'm feeling good. We're talking about the TEKS today.
That's always something good. And you were on spring break last week, so did you have a good break?
I did. It was nice to just disconnect a little bit, and now I feel refreshed. I'm ready to go. How about you?
Well, we're on break this week, so I'm as refreshed as I can get for this podcast. So I'm excited. My kids are back in school, and so this is a good week off for me to get some things done. So I'm excited to be here today, and we've got a great topic of discussion. So we're going to talk today a little bit about really follow up with what we did in our last podcast with Greta and jump into the heart of the TEKS, which is the overarching outcome of communication. So I was super impressed last time with Greta that she was able to just that whole story of how they came to communication with this group is that being the overarching outcome of the TEKS. And I think it's safe to say, Meredith, if you talk to any teacher or coordinator or administrator or even students and you ask them what the purpose of being in class is, you know, I always did this as a teacher in a level 1 class, and kids would inevitably say, well, I'm here to learn to speak the language. I'm here to learn to understand the language. I'm here to communicate. So I think we can all agree that communication is the purpose, but understanding what communication is, that's always been something that I felt like is a little ominous. So if you would have asked me early on in my teaching days, what is communication? I don't know if I could have come up with a really good, solid definition. And therefore, I really probably wouldn't have been able to tell you what we were doing in the class that was communicative and what was not. So let's start off today by getting a good definition of communication. This is something that really changed the way I taught once I came across this about 6 or 7 years ago. This definition is coming to us from Bill Van Patten, and I think he would even cite some of his earlier sources on where he pulled this definition from. But I feel like it's a brilliant definition. It's got some good components in it. And so let's go ahead and look at it. And the definition is that communication is the expression, interpretation, and sometimes negotiation of meaning within a given context, and it's purposeful. So Meredith, when's the first time you came across that definition here?
So the first time that I ever really had this kind of what is communication, what is language, like present given to me on a platter. It's like, oh, thinking about this. I was actually in graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin and taking my teaching methods course with Dr. Salaberry. And it was the first time that we ever asked ourselves, what is communication? What is language? And, you know, everybody kind of came to the agreement and kind of a shocked understanding that it's like, oh my gosh, we've all been teaching language for years, and we've never stopped to consider what the definition of language is and the definition of communication. And so for me, I just felt like, wow, how can we as a profession be working when we can't even readily and thoroughly define what we're teaching. And so that really hit hard for me. It really made me want to be able to define communication in a better way. And so, you know, I had read some texts that, you know, offered several different definitions and, you know, problematized each one of them. But when I read this Bill Van Patten definition, probably in 2016, I just absolutely fell in love with it. It's easy to understand. There are 5 elements, and we as teachers can really go through and check ourselves to see if what we're asking our students to do is communicative by comparing what we're asking students to do with that definition. So I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. All right. So are we ready to jump in to like explore these elements of the definition a little bit? What do you think, James?
Yeah, let's do it. I feel like kind of pulling these out and pulling them apart, they're really telling, and it'll help us understand what communication is and what it isn't. I think maybe importantly of all too.
Yeah. I think talking about what it isn't is just as important as talking about what it is. And we'll give some examples here in just a minute or two. But sometimes defining what things aren't actually helps us understand, like, oh, because sometimes when we hear the definition, we think, oh yeah, I'm already doing that. I'm doing that. I'm doing that.
I was amazed once we pulled this definition out and you start analyzing it. I was amazed at how many things I thought I was doing in the class that were leading to communication just were not communicative.
Right.
At all, or maybe even partially. Even some of the things I thought were kind of my best practices, we just were kind of going through the motions, and it really didn't have some of these elements to them. And so that was pretty
interesting. Yeah. So let's take a deep dive in here. So let's start off with communication is the expression, right? That's how we start out. And most teachers, when I do professional learning, I'm like, what does that mean? What is expression? And most people are pretty like, yeah, like language comes out, right? Like language is produced from one human being. Teachers often tell me there's a message that is going from one direction, one person to the other. And so that's what expression is. In our TEKS, expression looks like asking questions, responding to questions, describing, informing. All of these verbs or language functions are functions of expression. Interpretation, folks are normally pretty good to understand what this is, but interpretation basically means the language is going into the body. So the person is making meaning, right? They're understanding the message that is being sent to them. And we see this in our TEKS in the interpretive strand or interpretive mode of communication. And we see language functions like infer or demonstrate understanding. So expression and interpretation, two fundamental first pieces of what communication is.
Let me ask this. Do you have to have expression and interpretation all the time?
Yep. You got to have all five elements there. And that's when I think we start getting into some partially communicative things. Because if we'll see some examples here, or maybe we'll just give an example now. Like if you have expression, but there's no interpretation and no negotiation of meaning, then it's like, well, it's partially communicative.
These examples of, when I lived in another country and you drive down the road, you'd see these billboards out on the road. I mean, you do it here.
Yeah.
If nobody's reading them, they're not doing a very good job of communicating, right? So there has to be some interpretation on somebody's end. They're certainly expressing something, but if you're not there to interpret, then it doesn't matter.
Right. And we like to think like, oh, just because the kids' mouths are moving, which would be expression, or in American Sign Language, if they're signing, we're like, oh, they're expressing. That's great. But if the person who is receiving the message doesn't care, isn't listening, is just sitting there, doesn't ask follow-up questions, then really we're not getting good communication. So I'll just jump in and give an example really quickly with the old turn and tell your partner. Yes. Activity, right, in class. So if we say turn and tell your partner what you did last weekend, we have expression, but we may or may not have interpretation. I mean, what if the partner A speaks first and they say, I went to the movies, I went to work, I did my homework, and person B is just sitting there.
Yeah.
They don't react. They don't ask follow-up questions. They're not demonstrating in any way that they care. They could have cotton plugged in their ears for all we know, right? And so we would say that activity is partially communicative. There is expression, but there's really no interpretation, and there's no negotiation of meaning either, which leads us to the third piece of the definition. So when you're in the interpersonal mode, specifically here, if you are a listener, then what if somebody says something you don't understand? then you need to ask for clarification, or you need to make a good guess as to what the other person is trying to say. So if I say something that you don't understand, then in interpersonal mode, you're going to negotiate the meaning, which means you're going to try to figure out what I'm saying, either by asking me directly, indicating that you don't understand, or trying to make an educated guess. And we see this, well, we don't see this in class a lot in activities like turn and tell your partner.
Yeah.
What if you told me what you did last weekend and I was out for 3 weeks and didn't know any of the vocabulary?
So let me ask you this, because I know where we're heading here, and I'm kind of looking ahead, but how do we get that negotiation? Because a teacher simply saying, you have to do this, or because we're going to have a test on that might motivate some, but motivation isn't a great factor to drive this negotiation sometimes. So how do we get something to be communicative without, basically threatening our students that if they don't do it, we're going to give them a 0?
Right. Well, great question, because I think context and purpose, which are the last 2 elements of the definition of communication, really are big players. For example, if we're giving students context or situations to talk about that are forced or unnatural, then they're not going to be as engaged, and they're going to be less likely to be curious about what their partner is talking about. So for example, context is a situation. We see context gone wild, like so many times in classrooms, because we'll say, turn and tell your partner what you're wearing, the clothes you're wearing. Okay. Now, the context, nobody does that in real life. That's not a real situation. People, what would people be curious about? Like,
you don't show up to work and tell somebody what you're wearing when they can
no,
see in front of them.
No, but you might say, oh, wow, I like your jacket. Where did you get it? Oh, was it on sale? Right. So we have to think about the situation that we frame the communication in the classroom. And so we have to make sure that we're offering like real situations that people would do. Sorry if I'm being a little bit repetitive here. So that's one thing that we have to think about. And then also the purpose, which is the last element of the definition of communication, is extremely important, because, turn and tell your partner what you did last weekend, and tell your partner what you're wearing. There is no communicative purpose. The purpose is because I said so, the teacher, right? The purpose is to practice the vocabulary. Bill Van Patten tells us that there are 2 purposes for using language: cognitive informational, which is to learn new information about ourselves and the world in which we live, and psychosocial, which is, I like to kind of think of like as a little high five of language. That psychosocial is when you get on an elevator and you say, wow, sure is hot today, right? Or we're just kind of like doing a little linguistic handshake, right? Entertainment is also psychosocial use of language. So when kids don't have a purpose, then they're going to be not just kids, any human beings on the planet don't have a real purpose for communicating, and they're not learning about other people and connecting with people in the world in which they live. Then we don't have true communication, right? We have kind of like a quasi-communicative practice at most.
Well, let me throw this out too, because this was a hard part. As I started to learn this definition, it was very easy to recognize, was I bringing interpretation opportunities and expression opportunities for my students into the classroom? The context and the purpose was really where I struggled. Even negotiation, I could understand, okay, I want to create these opportunities for students to negotiate. They can do that in the interpretive mode. They can do that in the interpersonal, and even in the presentational. There'll be students that are listening to that can try to negotiate meaning out of that. Mm-hmm. But the context and purpose was where I struggled to understand, how could I manipulate those, or how could I change those? And really, once I started to understand, look, the context, we're in the classroom. Mm-hmm. Our context isn't really changing. We're not at a restaurant. We're not at the airport. We could role play that and pretend that all we want, but at some point, if we start to do that, the purpose become slighted there, and we don't really have a purpose at some point. And that's really what started to drive things, is what was the purpose behind what we were doing. And so how can we create a purpose in this? Because you said turn and tell your partner. I think every teacher in the history of language teaching has used maybe that strategy to get kids talking, right?
Yeah.
So, to have them turn and say, hey, talk about what you're wearing. How do we create something with a purpose? Because I don't think it's the strategy. You want them talking to each other.
Oh, yeah.
How do we get that purpose?
Right. So there's a very simple fix here, and it's just ask the kids to do the TEKS. So, and if we look at our interpersonal TEKS, nowhere in there as a student expectation does it say turn and tell your partner, but it does say ask and respond to questions or express and exchange an opinion. So let's take our turn and tell your partner about what you did last weekend, and let's take that from a quasi-communicative task to a fully communicative task. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the instructions, and we're going to say, okay, kids, I want you to get in groups of 2, and I want you to ask and respond to questions about your typical weekend using some simple sentences and simple elaboration. And the purpose is to figure out what you and your partner have in common. Now we've hit all 5 components of communication. Students are expressing, they're asking and responding, they have to interpret because they have to understand what their partner is saying or the question that their partner is asking in order to ask follow-up questions and answer questions correctly. We have negotiation of meaning, because if somebody doesn't understand something, they are going to have to say, oh, sorry, can you repeat that? Or I'm not sure what that means in the target language. They have to be able to do that to keep the conversation going. And then the context is, we're in a classroom and we're trying to learn about each other, and the purpose about our weekend activities. And the purpose is to find out what we have in common. So if a student stops me as a teacher, and it's like, Miss, why are we doing this? It's not a rude question at all. And, my answer for scenario A, turn and tell your partner, my answer for that is because you need to practice your vocabulary, or because I told you to, or because we have a test coming up. That's not a good answer for kids, right? But in scenario B, ask and answer questions about your typical weekend with your partner to find out what you have in common. If a kid stops me in the middle of class and says, Miss, why are we doing this? It's like to find out what we have in common, right? Like, isn't that so much more beautiful than, because you're going to have to take a test on it? I mean, let that sink in. Listeners, let that sink in for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's hard to do sometimes, I think. I think understanding that is the key, and understanding that, look, if we can bring that purpose in, and now we're using this information for something, or the kids need to figure this out with each other because of X, Y, Z. Now we've inserted this purpose, and now kids have a reason to interpret and a reason to express.
Yeah.
In practice.
Yeah, and they're talking about themselves. I didn't give partner A a set of words and partner B a set of words, and you're pretending you're Miguel and you're pretending you're Anna, and that's all fake, and kids are like bloodhounds. They sniff out the fake in our classrooms, and instead of saying, excuse me, oh, go ahead.
We get frustrated as teachers because we think, why don't they want to be motivated to do this, and some kids are. Let's be real. A lot of kids are motivated they'll turn and talk to their partner, and they'll try to understand what's going on. But the rest of the kids, that just kind of leaves them at the door thinking, this isn't, I don't care about this. And if they're not invested in that, and then we get frustrated that they're not motivated, and why are they not motivated, and how do we motivate them? Really having a purpose behind that can help motivate them. It's not going to get every kid, but it certainly allows them to do something for a reason.
Right. Yeah. And I, being a regional consultant, I get to work with a lot of different teachers. And I get a lot of qualitative feedback that they're like, Dr. Clark, it works. Like I'm trying it. My kids are more engaged. They're talking in class. And so I have never heard anybody come back to me and say that it doesn't work when they change the context and the purpose for communication. And when they start asking kids to do the TEKS instead of some of these quasi-communicative tasks, like write 5 sentences about your house. Oh, well, that's presentational communication, right? And it's like, well, it's expression, but who's interpreting it? And
Why?
Is anybody negotiating meaning? And, why? We have a context. It's about your house, but why? What's the purpose of writing 5 sentences about your house?
Absolutely.
So, having that definition of communication just helps us so much.
Yeah, it's really played a big part in how I taught. And I think if you were to, if I were to give any new teacher advice on where do you start with teaching, obviously you have your TEKS there and it's great to go through, but again, communication is the overarching outcome of the TEKS, which is why we're having this discussion today. So understanding this definition would rank up there near the top of what I would hope a teacher coming into the profession would understand.
Right.
And it's not an easy definition to understand. It takes some time to go through and apply this in there and to see what's happening and kind of continuously ask yourself, what's our context? What's our purpose?
Right. It is the barometer for everything that we do in our classrooms. It really is.
It's pretty interesting to see that you start to notice that, okay, these things are not as communicative as maybe other things that I do in the class. And they might still have a place, but at the end of the day, communication is that overarching outcome, and that's really driving. So let's take a look further at how the TEKS break this down, because you might think that, okay, I remember going back when I first learned this, we sat down and somebody said, I want you to write down what you think the definition of communication is. Hadn't heard this definition before in my life. And I remember we sat there as a group and we came up with things like, oh, it's reading and it's writing and it's speaking. And I think in our minds, you kind of all have this idea of what communication is, and it's not wrong.
Right.
Skills are involved in there, but the TEKS break it down to these modes of communication and not the skills. It's not listed as reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And here's how we read better in another language. It's looking at it through these lenses of the modes of communication. So you have the interpersonal mode of communication, the interpretive mode, and the presentational mode. And within those modes, you're constantly going back and forth with those skills. And so those skills are involved in those different modes of communication. But it's not broken down into the skills. And I like that a lot, because the skills in and of themselves are not communication. We read and we write and we speak and we listen as part of communicating with others, but in and of themselves, those skills are not communication.
Right. So like if we do writing in a vacuum with no audience and no purpose, like the example we just talked about, write 5 sentences about your house using, these, what do we, like teachers, like what do we normally ask kids we say like, write 5 sentences about your house using the prepositions. Right. Yeah. And it's like, that's writing, but it's not communication. Right. So our question then would be, again, you're talking about these 4 skills, but why don't we say reading anymore? We don't, right? Because reading inherently just by itself or speaking practice is not communication.
And that's not to say I don't want listeners to think that those skills are not important. They're huge, and being able to communicate and developing those skills are important. And you can break down each one of those skills and say, look, in reading, there's these micro skills and these macro skills, and there's top down and bottom up approaches of learning how to read better. The same with writing. There's ways that we can write better and be more elaborate in how we use our sentences and our sentence structures and our text types. And those are great. We can sit down and focus on some of those things, but at the end of the day, if we want to communicate, we're using one of these modes of communication, which involves some of these skills, multiple of these skills often. And so in the interpretive mode, you're either reading, or you're listening,
Mm-hmm.
there's some writing present, or there's somebody who's speaking that's there that's present. And so you're using both of those skills there. In the
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal mode, you're negotiating meaning with somebody by speaking and listening, or by reading and writing. And the same in the presentational mode. Somebody's either speaking or writing and presenting something, but there's an audience who's going to be interpreting that.
And there's a purpose.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
even you said, like, even if it's for entertainment, like if you're at a play, you're interpreting that and you're getting a message from that. Otherwise it could be very informative. We watch YouTube videos all the time and TED Talks, and we learn information through presentational mode as well. So I really like how the TEKS break this down into the 3 modes of communication, because now that allows us to look at it from a communicative standpoint. Not necessarily a standpoint, okay, I'm a language teacher, that means I got to build these skills all the time. We do build those skills, but we're really focused on building those skills so that we can use them in these 3 modes of communication.
Right. And if we build the skills with no real relationship to context or purpose, like we might build the technical skill, but it's like there's like, we got to get up here to get to communication, right? So how many kids can, write sentences, but they don't know how to organize the sentences into ideas, and they haven't considered what the audience would be interested in learning and how they should package that information for the audience, right? If all we teach kids to do is write the sentences, to do the expression part, which is the ideas, but we haven't considered, how it will be interpreted, by whom it will be interpreted, what's the purpose, and all of these things, then we've stopped short. Okay. And we haven't reached full communication. So I think when we think about teaching some of these skills in isolation, yes, we're building the skills, which is good, but it's like we fall short just a little bit from reaching that full definition of communication. And so then we see kids that get out into their jobs or professional lives, and they are unable to communicate. And that's because we haven't been going the full mile. We haven't been finishing the race in teaching communication.
Well, let me ask you this. So again, because building those skills are critical, and as teachers, we're constantly presenting students with input that they're either reading or they're listening to, and we're trying to build those comprehension skills a lot of times through that input piece. So where's the balance, or how do we build those skills while also kind of maintaining this goal of communication in the classroom?
So I think that the first step is a huge mindset shift. And we have to break away from saying that I'm a language teacher. We are not language teachers. We are communication teachers. I'm not a Spanish teacher. I teach communication. I just happen to do it in Spanish, or whatever it is that the language that you're teaching. And I think shifting this mindset gets us away from the mechanics, teaching the mechanics only of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and really focusing on teaching for communication, which again is expression, interpretation, sometimes negotiation of meaning in a given context with a purpose. And once that mindset shift happens, then we can teach the TEKS fully. Because again, in the presentational TEKS, it never says write sentences about your family, but it does say describe people, objects, and simple situations, right? So once we have that mindset shift, then we can go into the TEKS and look at these student expectations and understand them under the lens of what they're really asking kids to do. For example, another presentational student expectation is to inform others orally. So if I'm going to ask students to inform other people about, I don't know, their school policies, or what's going on in their communities, or what's going on within their student population, I'm going to ask them, to consider all of the parts of communication, right? What do you guys want to express? Who's going to be interpreting it? what happens if people don't understand, what you're saying? How can you write it so that they can understand what you're saying and they don't have problems understanding you? The context is the situation. How do you write to inform people within this about this context? And then again, what is the purpose? It's to share information with people. And so our student expectations open the door. They roll the red carpet out for us as teachers to teach to that full definition of communication. And we can do it, but we gotta start asking kids to do the student expectations and the TEKS.
Yeah, that's great. I really like how you put that. The challenge, I think, is really finding that purpose behind that, right? We can pull out those student expectations where we're expressing and exchanging personal opinions or preferences. And again, just having somebody turn to their neighbor and say, tell 5 things that you like to do on the weekend. That's something that I think we see all the time. You walk in a good teacher's classroom, and they're going to have their students turning and talking to their partners and telling them about 5 things they like to do, or 5 things they like about this situation. And maybe be pushing them as far as elaborating and text type and those types of things as well. But what's the purpose behind that? Why are you doing that? Is it really just to practice? Because if so, the engagement might be low. There might not be interpretation. There's no purpose behind it. And so, students will check out at that point.
Yeah.
Having
also
talk to their partner and say, hey, look, we're going to talk about 5 things that you like to do on the weekends, because we're trying to figure out as a class, what are our favorite things to do? So I need you to go find 5 people and let's get some of their answers down. Then when we come back together, we're going to share these and we're going to figure out as a class, what are our top 5 favorite things to do?
Right.
That might not seem like the most exciting purpose in the world, but it's a purpose nonetheless. And so now you're having to communicate and share and express this information, so we can use it for something.
Yeah. And people are always complaining. They're like, oh, kids don't know how to talk to each other. And, if people would just find out what they have in common, the world would be such a better place. And so while the purpose of find out what we have in common may seem kind of like a sweet little, purpose, it's really important, if we think about some of the complaints, that the older generation makes about these kids. It's like, well, where would kids learn how to communicate? Where would they learn what they have in common? In world languages class. Hello, this is why what we do is so important. And, I get so excited, when I think about the potential of what we can do when we're teaching for communication, instead of just teaching language parts. Dr. Florencia Henshaw mentions in her book that, on common ground. So of all the second language acquisition, and Maris Hawkins, co-author, all of the, second language acquisition research that has come out, like of all of that, like, where's the common ground, right? We agree that teaching language parts and vocabulary does not lead to second language acquisition. And so let's also let that sink in. And so if we're just teaching skills in isolation, reading, writing, right, and we're not going to full communication and we're just teaching language parts, then with no purpose, then it doesn't happen for kids,
I think you can see, just over the years that's kind of been the common practice, is that we teach about language. And it's been this constant, we have students that come in and parents that come in and say, oh, I took this in high school and I don't remember anything. And I have a very similar experience, taking French in high school. And now that I'm going back and revisiting, learning that with my son, it's a very different process. We're doing things for a reason. We're doing things together and we're trying to communicate on different topics because we want to learn about them or because we want to share information together. And looking back at my high school experience, where it was this constant, here's a worksheet, let's fill in the blank with the correct verb or the phrase. And again, it's not that the teacher wasn't trying to get us to interpret something. There were certainly things we had to try to read. That lack of purpose, or there were times when we would turn and talk to our partners and we would have to write out 5 sentences to, script our our conversation together, and we'd get up and perform this in front of the class. But at the end of the day, you know, as somebody who wasn't going to encounter French anywhere in Dallas, Texas, for the most part, I didn't see much of a purpose in that. And so it was easy for me to not be motivated. It was easy for me to check out.
And, you know, people say all the time, these kids don't want to learn. There could be nothing further than the truth. They do. They just they have a purpose, and they're curious about maybe things that we're not giving them in the classroom. That's why I love using authentic texts in the class, right? And that's mentioned in our TEKS, right? We need to use texts that are used in the target culture, right? So, and those are inherently more interesting, and we learn so much more from reading an authentic French movie poster than we do from, you know, reading a, you know, watered down text, you know, that's been presented. Either maybe I got it off Teachers Pay Teachers, or I got it out of the textbook, whatever, you know. And I know that the term authentic text has been problematized a little bit, but yeah, I mean, like, I'd rather see a German car commercial than a fake video that came with my textbook, right? As a kid, you learn so much more that way, and they are interested in learning. They're just not interested in learning about fake stuff.
Well, sure. And I've always thought it's really fascinating as a level 1 teacher, you get these kids in their day one, and you'd go through this whole thing of, we're going to learn to ask and respond to questions about each other. So we're going to introduce ourselves and learn a little bit about each other. And I see teachers do this all the time, and they're great at it. And they'll, in the target language, have these kids introducing themselves, and the kids are fascinated. This is the first thing they've learned with language. They can come in, they can say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and they're excited. And they get to share this information with each other, and we're getting information from each other, and we're finding out, you know, where everybody's from in the class, and we're learning about each other. So there's a purpose there. And then day 2, we turn around and go, all right, let's correct it all by learning the grammar and the vocabulary.
Right. Here's the verb said, right? Yeah. Like, here's the verb.
We're so good at just taking that great experience that was communicative and then saying, all right, that's the last time we're doing this. And we're going to jump to something else because we know how to teach language all of a sudden.
Yeah. And I've had teachers tell me that exact thing. They're like, I did it, like we did in the Korean model lesson that you did. And then the next day, I didn't know what to do. Right. And then we just did worksheets.
Yeah.
So how do we not do that? How do we not do that, James?
I think that leads to the good question is how do we continue to strive to have communication in the classroom? And I think going back to all of these things is it's not going to be perfect all the time. And you're going to see things that you do in the classroom where maybe you are focused on building reading skills or building up listening skills or even writing and speaking skills. But as long as I think you're doing that with the purpose of saying, okay, we're going to do that so that when we get to this communicative event later on in class, now we're going to be better with it. You know, we're going to focus a little bit on the reading here because I'm going to present to you another reading in a second. And I want you guys to get some information from that we're going to use in our class today, and either for an output piece or to drive some kind of understanding that we have. And so striving for that communication is I think the first thing is really putting that at the forefront, because if you got that there at the forefront, you're going to be able to kind of backwards plan and look at, all right, how do we get up to this communicative event, even if my kids can't do it in the moment right now?
Right. And so this is kind of leading us to a question that we had talked about earlier, which is, what would we say to a teacher who says, well, they have to practice. They have to practice for 5 weeks, practice the language parts, because if not, they can't have a conversation. And this is a question that I get a lot in professional learning. I know that you probably get it too. And so if we think about what is the place for language practice, in the classroom. And so if we go back to the ask, turn and tell your partner versus ask and respond to questions, right? A teacher could argue, well, they need to turn and tell their partner because they just need to practice getting the words out of their mouths, right? Sure. And so it's like, okay, sure, maybe, right? But couldn't we just as easily teach the kids how to ask and respond to question so that they do that from the very beginning? even though it may not be perfect, even though it may be jumbled, right? The students still understand that what's being expected of them is a tennis match, right? So I ask a question, right? The ball's in your court. You had to understand. Now you're going to respond appropriately. The ball comes back to me. I'm going to react, ask a follow-up question, etc. So I feel like there's this notion out there that we can't communicate unless we practice for 6 weeks first or 5 weeks. And so what I would say is for us to become informed thinkers as language teachers or communication teachers rather, and challenge this notion of practice has to happen before communication. Can communication happen from the get-go? It happened on the first day when you said, hola, me llamo Meredith, soy de Carolina del Norte, right? And we're getting kids going back and forth that way. So let's challenge this notion of they have to practice the parts first. They can start communicating first if we give them those sentence stems, if we've taught them how to negotiate, meaning, oh, I'm sorry, could you repeat that, right? If we've taught them those communication strategies, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
No doubt we're going to have to help them prop up their communication. And I think that's where we're starting to think now on this definition. Like if our focus is on communication, not the language necessarily.
Right.
What helps would they need to be able to communicate? You know,
Yeah.
mention sentence stems or a vocabulary list or a word wall or scaffolded output. These are all things that we talk about, and even on the input side, what things are we doing to help them understand and make meaning of that? Are we showing them pictures? Are we gesturing? Are we helping them understand the input through different strategies so that they can be successful in communication? It's not being successful with the language all the time. It's being successful communicating with the language.
Right.
So we want them to be able to interpret and to express and negotiate meaning. They're going to need some help with that as younger students. And again, on these day ones, we do a great job of, we put the phrases there on the board that they can use, like hola, me llamo, and they say it wrong, but they're excited and they go around and they're using these to ask and answer questions, and they might have to look at the board, but and they're able to get this message across. And then slowly we take those scaffolds down and we allow them to do it without.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I teach ESL every Saturday, and I have a big poster that says in Spanish, lo que dices cuando no entiendes. What do you say when you don't understand? Because they'll just all break into Spanish and start like, what does that mean? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, we're not doing that. So, allowing them to negotiate meaning is a super important part of the communication there. And that volley, that interpersonal communication, which is that tennis match of, hey, how are you? Fine, back and forth, will completely break down if students can't negotiate for meaning, saying, oh, can you repeat that, please? Or, so having all of these elements are really important. And I think we can do that from the get-go, day one. The kids don't have to practice for the first semester so that they can communicate the second half of the year, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Let's go ahead and let's recap this really quick.
Okay.
I feel like we've got a lot of information here. And so if we funnel this back down and really tie it to where we started at the beginning, is there's this definition of communication that really fits for our field. And that's the expression, interpretation, negotiation of meaning in a given context, and communication that's purposeful. Understanding those 5 components is key, and understanding that communication is the driver behind language acquisition. You mentioned that earlier. If we're not communicating, if they're not receiving input in the target language, either through speaking or through reading, there's no chance of acquisition happening. We might be able to teach about language and explicitly remember patterns and things about language, but there's no acquisition there. And so this idea that we're acquiring language, which is really the end goal anyways, and that's going to allow us to speak more proficiently and more fluently, if you will, then that communication has to be present. And so starting to do things that are communicative, using the target language and having interactions that are purposeful in the classroom that's really driving that. And so a couple things to think about. What are some things we could kind of leave out on this, Meredith?
So I want to share a little story and then some things to think about. This is a true story. It happened to me. I was teaching Spanish in a high school in Texas. And I had a student whose grandfather was from Cuba and he spoke Spanish, and she really wanted to learn Spanish so that she could talk to him. She was not a heritage speaker. She didn't know any Spanish. And she said, Senorita Clark, I'm so excited to be in this class so I can learn Spanish. And you know what I said in my head silently? I said, oh, mija, you're not going to learn any Spanish in here. Because I knew that the way we were teaching it wasn't communicative. Now, at that point in my career, I could not have told you the definition of communication. And at that point in my career, this was before the new TEKS came out, we were just teaching language parts. It's what everybody did. We followed the textbook and we just taught language parts. So I always keep that story in my mind. And so if you ever find, like our listeners, if they ever find themselves thinking, oh yeah, these kids really aren't going to learn, then that is a signal that we need to think about things differently. And here's some takeaways. We have to teach the definition, we have to teach communication. How do you know if you're teaching kids to do how do you know if you're teaching kids to communicate? Just run through the 5 components of that definition and ask yourself, is there expression? Are the kids interpreting? Are they negotiating meaning? Is there a real life context that makes sense? That's not a weird context, contrived context. And are we learning about the world, and ourselves? And if you plan an activity or a lesson and you run it through kind of the litmus test of this definition and it doesn't match, then tweak something, change something. Maybe all you need to do is change the purpose, or maybe all you need to do is change the instructions to match the student expectations in the TEKS, right? Instead of saying turn and tell, let's ask students to ask and respond, right? So these are things to think about as we all move forward, and then also just to really change the perception of what we do as a profession. I know I said you're not a language teacher, you're a communications teacher, and people probably want to throw rocks at my face when I say that, but seriously, like it's good to think about, right? Like, let's think about it.
It certainly changes the focus, I think. And again, I know both of our stories and kind of how this definition drove what we did in the classroom and our understanding of what we were doing in the classroom. It really helped, and it meant a lot to me to be able to look at what I was doing through that lens. Kind of same what you just said. Up until that point, it just felt like we were going through and trying a lot of different things and spinning our wheels and doing things that we thought were helping kids learn the language, and that if they were just more motivated, or if they just studied more, if they just tried harder.
Yep, we blame it on the kids.
More successful. And we did have kids that were very good and had high aptitudes and were great at memorizing things. And so they could kind of get through these level 1 and 2 classes, good level at a novice high level, and kind of get through on some of that memorized words and phrases and that learning style. But the majority of our kids were checked out, and that was a frustrating thing as a teacher. And so to understand this and then start to have that influence my practice really made a difference in what I was doing with kids. It made what I did made it feel a little bit more meaningful, and that we really could learn another language.
Yeah.
And that was the goal, to communicate with this language. And so they could come in and I could say, hey, look, by the end of this year, you are going to be speaking, reading, writing, and listening in Spanish. We're going to do that because we're communicating throughout the year.
Right. And I'm going to, follow up with, not only is teaching for communication inherently more engaging, more beneficial, all of the good things for the student, just as you mentioned, like, you felt better. You felt like when you changed to teach communication more, that there was more of a purpose in your classroom, and you feel better as a teacher right? And you know what happened to me after I had the Mija, you're not going to learn any Spanish in here moment? I quit teaching because I thought I am wasting their time, and I cannot teach them to actually communicate because I have to cover all these chapters and all of these grammar points. And this is an epic failure, and I'm not going to stay on a sinking ship. And so I quit teaching. And so the implications of teaching for communication are not only 1,000% beneficial for our students and our state, right, and our nation, but they're 1,000% beneficial for us too, because we need teachers to stay engaged. We need them to feel passionate. And every teacher wants to feel like the kids are actually learning the language, which means communicate, right? So teaching for communication is just wonderful for everybody.
Well, I wish I could have quit too, but I needed the money, so I just
right. Well, I went to graduate school, so
it's very, very good.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, this was great. I'm so glad that we've touched upon this today, because again, coming off of that episode with Greta and the TEKS, it was very evident that communication was the center point of the TEKS and is the center point of the TEKS. It was fascinating to see how they came to that conclusion. And I'm glad they did, because, you know, if you would have pulled any of the other 4 C's in there, it just wouldn't have made as much sense. And so the focus being on communication now really allows us to go down this path and help our kids use the language and be more proficient with the language, which really drives us to our next conversation, because communication is really half of what we're doing in our class. We're helping kids communicate, but we also need to do that at appropriate levels. And so understanding, you know, in a level 1 class, how well should they be able to communicate? In a level 2 class, how well should they be able to communicate? That really allows us to have a benchmark for these students as to how well they can do that. But it also allows us to push them towards the next benchmark. And so our next episode, let's get into the proficiency guidelines and what the TEKS define for those, as far as the different levels and where the goals are for our students and the expectations there. And let's talk a little bit about what that means, because that really will allow us to push our students forward and allow them to stay on this pathway towards proficiency, as we call it.
I can't wait. I'm so excited.
Awesome. Well, for those of you listening, thanks for being here. We look forward to next time. And on behalf of Meredith, my name's James, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Have a good day.
All right. Take care, guys.